Good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be here today with some CEOs of very different companies. Stéphane Boujnah, CEO and Chairman of Euronext, Stéphane Israël, Chairman and CEO of Ariane Espace, and Claire Vazon, Executive Vice President at ENGIE, in charge of corporate secretariat, strategy, research and innovation, and communication. So we're going to talk about the pivot that we are experiencing. And I'd like to start by reminding a few facts about the economic competitiveness of Europe versus US and China. When we look at the GDP evolution between 2010 and 2020, Europe has actually grown slower than the US. And it was a different picture from the 70s to 2010. So we are experiencing a relative slowdown. And when we look at companies above 1 billion, we took a sample of more than 3,000 companies. We see on 4 indicators some gaps between European companies and US companies. So on profitability, European companies are 3 points lower. On growth, European companies are growing relatively 40% slower than the US companies. And then when we look at investments and R&D, we also have a gap that is actually more significant for R&D than investment. The gap for R&D is 40%. So why is this important? It's important because, on the other hand, Europe has a very different social model. And when you look at inequalities, parity, gender parity, life expectancy, social mobility, and decarbonation, there is actually some superior numbers for Europe. And it's not always intuitive because, for instance, on parity, actually, the average of Europe is twice better than the US, according to different surveys and barometers. On life expectation, it's 81 years old in Europe. It's 79 in the US, 73 in China. On mobility, on social mobility, that was for me also surprising. We actually have a lot of the European countries in the top 10 social mobility countries in the world. And finally, on environmental transition, a European produces 2.4 less CO2 as of today, but we are also reducing our carbon footprint by 30 to 50% faster than the US. So we have this imbalance of economic competitiveness where we are, slowing down versus the US and investing less. And we have a social model that has been resilient so far, but will need to be financed in the years to come. The second point I wanted to make is before the war in Ukraine in 2020, there was the big Green Deal at European level with the Fit for 55. So commitments to be carbon neutral by 2050 and to reduce by 55% by 2030. And we had actually also quantified this in great details. We've published on this. We looked at more than 600 levers, 75 subsectors, 25 countries and so on. And we quantified that this was actually completely achievable. Nevertheless, beyond the ability to decarbonize, it also comes with a social transition. And what we have assessed is that if we were to move to carbon neutrality, we would actually destroy 6 million jobs. We would create 11 million jobs. So the net would be positive, plus 5 million, if you followed me. Nevertheless, these aren't the same people. So minus 6 plus 11 equal 5 requires very important support. So now to transition to what we are experiencing with the war in Ukraine, and I think everyone has the the idea of the energy cost rising, skyrocketing, and actually the cost of production increasing by 50% when you take into account both energy and raw materials. So what do we do regarding this environmental transition? We've talked about a detour, meaning we are keeping the direction, but there are trade-offs to be made on the path to neutrality, given the situation that we are in. So I don't want to do an introduction that is too long and too didactic, but I wanted to put these numbers on the table. And I'll ask each of you, maybe individually, to share what I call the reasons to believe. Where do you see unique forces, assets, to face this situation on the economic and environmental sides? So maybe Stéphane.
No, the reasons to believe are, in my view, extremely concrete, tangible, and simple. It's quite common to do some Europe bashing, but when you look at what has happened over the past 2 years, this is amazing. We have seen amazing operational successes of Europe as a group. In 2020, during the peak of the COVID crisis, the bureaucracy of the European Commission started to build a sort of continental purchasing machine to buy vaccines from 3 pharma. And within a matter of a few months, we were able to coordinate the vaccination of 450 million human beings living in this part of the world in a coordinated manner, in a way and at a cost that was faster, cheaper, and more homogeneous than anywhere else on the globe. And that was done because of the very strong, powerful coordination of the European machine and the way it was deployed and throughout the continent. Without the European Union coordination of the vaccination arrangements and agreements, vaccination would have been more expensive, slower, and less homogeneous across the continent. A few months later, in July, we had what was nicknamed the Hamiltonian moment. Basically, countries who work hard and pay taxes, to use caricature, decided to pool their rating to borrow money to spend and invest in countries that have been the most hit by COVID. And we decided together to raise 750 billion euros over the following 7 years. And this being implemented, and the money is being spent, is being invested in a framework of conditionality, which is de facto creating a sort of soft troika arrangements with some hard conditionality with certain countries, which is a sort of booster to structural reforms. More recently, we had the war in Ukraine. In a matter of days, we were able to coordinate the way to activate EU money to fund war efforts to support the freedom fighters of the Ukraine forces. So that led to a situation where, even if today the surface of things is to comment about the fact it's so complicated to agree on the cap on Russian oil, the reality is that the level of solidarity on energy is amazing. We have pooled the strategic reserves of gas across Europe in an unprecedented way. We are reversing the flows on some pipelines to bring GNL from the west to the east, etc., etc. So I'm confident and optimistic because Europe does work. So the surface of things, or the buzz about Scholz not being as friendly to Macron as Macron used to be friendly to Merkel, is the surface of things. The substance is what I've just described.
Thank you. So maybe the other Stéphane, reasons to believe, optimism.
Hello, everybody. So I think for us, the first reason to believe is not linked to Europe, is the fact that space, Arianespace is a launch service provider of Europe with Ariane and Vega rockets, space is living now or experiencing a new golden area. There is a rush for space, a rush towards a low Earth orbit. According to very serious studies, the space market could triple in the 20 coming years. There is a very strong interest from the government. So you have all seen the launch of the SLS, the Artemis mission. So we are experiencing a new golden area for space, which is the first reason to be optimism. After coming to Europe in this landscape, we have some reasons to have some concerns and we have some reasons to be optimistic. The reasons to have some concerns is that we do not have in Europe the same level of public and governmental mobilization as compared to the US. When it comes to the money invested in space, if you take Europe globally, the money we spent publicly in space is 5 times less important than in the US. It's approximately $60 billion every year, civil and military space in the US, as opposed to $12 billion, the equivalent or in euro, in Europe. So this is for sure a reason to have some concerns. And after, we do not have in Europe the very powerful billionaires existing in the US. Everybody has in mind Mr. Musk with SpaceX and now Tesla and Twitter having a capability which does not exist in Europe in terms of financial mobilizations to support its project. So there are some reasons to have some concerns, but on the other end, Europe is a very strong space power. Europe has a specific governance. There is a European Space Agency, which is an intergovernmental organization. There is also a space policy, which is under the responsibility of the European Commission. And we are, with no doubt, the second or the third space power. There is the US, China, and Europe. And maybe to elaborate on what Clarisse has said, we have also some specificities in Europe. The fact that for us sustainability is something absolutely mandatory is also reflected in our space policy. And I will quote one space program, which is not very famous, but which is very important. It is Copernicus. In Europe, we have 2 flagship programs. There is Galileo, which is about navigation, which is what we call the European GPS. But there is also Copernicus. And Copernicus is a constellation of satellites, 7 already in orbit and others to come, which is about sustainable development, sustainable environment, and the satellites are monitoring what is happening when it comes to land, to forest, to vegetation. They will also monitor the new generation emissions. And it is very interesting because it does not exist in the US. There is no such a program in the US. Mr. Trump, when he was president, has decided to cut drastically the investment from NASA in Earth observation and all what was dedicated to environment from space. And here we have a real leadership with this program. We can say that in terms of space at the service of your environment, Europe is leading the race, and this is a reason to be optimism. We have some DNAs in Europe. We really believe in sustainability. Sustainability is our future. And here, with this program, Copernicus, we pave the way for a sustainable space and more sustainability on Earth from space. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, last but not least, Claire, and then I'll go to more specific question for each of you. So reasons to believe.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, even though it's a bit cold, which reminds us of the energy crisis. So obviously, I will talk a lot about energy, but first reason to believe, I think you mentioned it, Clarisse. Europe is at the forefront in terms of decarbonation, in terms of moving forward towards carbon neutrality. It has set itself goals. It's consuming much less at this stage than its North American friends when you look at consumption of energy per GDP, and clearly less carbon emissions. So this is the first reason to believe structurally we had put ourselves on the right path. However, we are facing a massive shock, and I think that's, of course, a reason for attention. Some positive aspects in this massive shock is that we have been able together to ensure security of supply. It seems obvious these days, but if you think about the violence of the shock, of course, geopolitically, but also in terms of energy supply that we experienced in the last few months, we were cut out of gas from Gazprom progressively throughout the year, and we have been able together, the Europeans, to substitute other sources of supply to this Russian gas. This has been done, by the way, through a mixture of public action and public regulations at EU level, setting paths for storages and setting a regulation for storages in European countries. So that's for the public action. And private action. Private action is the play of market and the fact that it's industrial players which have, I would say, naturally looked at other sources of supply and been able to bring gas, to bring LNG, to increase also the supply from our Norwegian supplier into Europe. So that's a positive thing. Faced with an incredible crisis on our energy resources, we have been able together to ensure security of supply. And we are together in Europe in a situation where we started the winter, as you know, with very full storage capacities of gas. And we will decrease these storage capacities throughout the winter. But the general projections is that we should navigate this winter in reasonable conditions. And that's very good news. So we're now starting to turn ourselves to next winter. But here again, not at all a catastrophic picture under average conditions. So we have been able to ensure this security of supply. That's good news. And that shows that Europe, both through a combination of public action and private action, can move forward. Point of attention, however, the price of energy. Obviously, everywhere in Europe, we are facing a massive energy price shock. And that's a key concern for our industries. Prices of energy are roughly 5 times what they are in the US. And we see some big production drop in Europe. We are seeing the demand of gas by industrial firms in countries like Germany or France, for instance. We're seeing this drop amounting to roughly 25% to 30% over a 1-year period. That's huge. What does it say? Well, part of this drop is not a drop of production. Part of this drop is compensated by a switch from gas to other sources of energy. That's what you call, Clarisse, nicely, a detour. It's, of course, very bad news for the environment. When you substitute fuel to gas, you're moving in the wrong direction. When you're putting online or you're keeping online coal producing electricity facilities, you're emitting twice more than if you're using gas producing electricity facilities. So that's a step in the wrong direction, but it softens somehow a bit the gas price shock for some companies. However, what we're also seeing is a drop in industrial production. And we're seeing industries which are at this stage reducing their production faced with too high prices. So that's, of course, something which is very bad news, and something Europe must act upon to make sure that this doesn't become entrenched, this doesn't become structural. What do we need to do? Well, the answer is clear. We need to accelerate energy transition. So it's not only a detour that we're making, we're taking a step aside, sometimes in the wrong direction in the short run. The good news, however, and reason to believe, is that it's a formidable wake-up call. It's a formidable encouragement to accelerating energy transition. So we need right now in all of our countries to accelerate the production of renewable energy, be it renewable electricity energy, and this is PV, this is wind, both onshore and offshore, be it also heat production, including geothermal, and we need also to accelerate the production of renewable gases, biomethane and green hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen. These sources of energy are not only decarbonized, but they will also increase our security of supply and our autonomy in the years to come. So reason for hope and acceleration, a great opportunity to accelerate, and one that's on the table of European policymakers.
Thank you, Claire. I love the way that you somehow we can leverage the crisis, I would say, or we sometimes say never waste a crisis to actually accelerate change in the right direction. Stéphane, you want to tell us a little bit more on the impact for capital markets and whether these disruptions are game changing, and again, I think you have views that it can also be an opportunity.
Well, it's clear that pivoting from the world pre-22, where we had low inflation, low interest rates, massive liquidity, prospects of recovery of COVID that were extremely exciting, to a situation where we are now. I mean, clearly the type of outlook 12 months ago in the similar panels would have been very different. So we have inflation, albeit that seems to stabilize. I think they haven't seen enough comments. I mean, Claire is an economist, so she may have lights for us, but everywhere, inflation in November was lower in October. So we don't know yet whether it's a plateau or an indication or first signs of something covering. It seems that energy prices are having the same plateau effect to a certain extent. Clearly, the interest rates increase is now fully priced and in the market, and anticipations are there. It seems that second round inflation is going to be under control, at least on the basis of what we're observing for the moment in Europe. So there have been huge volatility. I'm still confident for 23, not because of the general outlook. The general outlook will be a softer year than what we have experienced pre-22 for sure. But the fundamental pillars of European growth are there. I mean, when you look at the strength of the European blue chips, they are going to have a good earning seasons for 22 at the beginning of 23. The global footprint of the larger European blue chips is strengthening everywhere. And the social cohesion is there. The savings are dynamics. Clearly, Europe is still one of the richest, if not the richest, part of the globe, with the widest social cohesion, which allows for support to purchasing power that is not equal to anywhere else in the planet. So, yes, there have been some volatility. But when you look at, for example, the indexes and all the information is in the market, but the CAC 40, just to use the French one, is at 6,500 points. It was at 6,100 in January 20. So it's not like something weird is happening and the market doesn't know what's in. It's just that the fundamental outlook of at least the large companies, the blue chip companies, is positive.
Thank you. So, Stéphane, I hesitate between two questions. One would be on R&D, and you mentioned the budget's allocation for aerospace research in Europe and in the US. Could be a question around that. Or I also I like your push saying there is an opportunity to help on the climate change and environmental transition from the space. So maybe you want to, because it's not obvious for everyone. How are these programs going to help the environmental transition?
Yes, so on the second point, space, in fact, has one opportunity and one challenge. The challenge, which is quite new, is the fact that as there is more and more activity, as there are more and more satellites in low Earth orbit, we have now a topic, a challenge to address, which is a sustainable space. And it's a new topic because it's really linked to this golden area I have mentioned and the fact that what is close to Earth between 500 kilometers to 1,500 kilometers, what we call the low Earth orbit, is now dedicated and it's new to connectivity and to hundreds and thousands of satellites, which are going to help connectivity on Earth. And it's totally new. And here it's a challenge because we have to guarantee a sustainable space in the long term. We have to make sure that these satellites will not leave behind them debris. If you have too many debris, you will have collisions, and then the low Earth orbit could become polluted as Earth is polluted. And so this is a challenge. And in Europe, by the way, we have regulations to make sure that the satellites must leave their orbit, that the launcher must be deorbited, the upper part of the launcher. So here again, Europe is paving the way for a more sustainable space, which again is absolutely a new challenge, which was not existing. But coming to your question, space as an opportunity for environment. And clearly, when you take what we call the variable climatique essentielle, ECV in English, 50% of them can be only monitored by space. You need to go to space to have a better understanding of the climate change. And this is where what we call traditionally Earth observation satellite can help to better understand environmental changes on Earth. With technologies which are radar or optical technologies, but also more and more the capability to track carbon emission from space. And space is really a tool, an asset for better monitoring environmental change on Earth. And as I have mentioned, Europe has believed in it long years ago. More than 20 years ago, Europe has decided to have this unique program, which is Copernicus. It's really a cooperative program between the European Union and the European Space Agency. And we have now unique assets in orbit to help to deliver space services to take care of environmental and climate change on Earth. And I really think it's an example where our European values can make the difference, and we should be proud of that. So I will not be too long, but satellites are perfectly adapted through their radar or optical capability and their ability to monitor what is happening on Earth. They are perfectly adapted, for instance, to monitor what is happening in Amazonia. If you want to know more about deforestation in Amazonia, there is no better solution than to have images from satellite. And more, we will have also the capability to track emissions. So this is an example. And with also, in parallel, this challenge that we must take care of a sustainable space. I will just say one remark, rebounding on what you have said about social protection in Europe, which is also one of our differentiators. I think a second differentiator, which will be more and more important, we are the most democratic continent. I think if you take the other continent, if you take our governments in Europe, you have at least almost democracy. And in the context we are experiencing, when we see what Russia is doing against Ukraine, this will be more and more a differentiator of Europe and a reason to promote our European values. I really strongly believe in that.
Thank you, Stéphane. Claire, back to you on the question of energy. So I think people wonder, are we going to have enough energy? And the second question is, are we going to increase or decrease or change our dependency in terms of the sources? And I think I heard you say that with the development of new sources of energy, we can actually potentially increase our independence on energy. So just maybe commenting on, so obviously there is a transition to get there, but maybe commenting on this, because people have this belief that we will reduce the dependency to Russia because we have no choice, but that we will probably or maybe are going to replace it with other types of dependency. I think you are saying something a bit more sophisticated. I think it would be great to hear you on that.
Thank you. Yes, it's a question that's an important one. Of course, in the short run, we have seen the consequences of too high a dependency, especially for the countries which were highly dependent on Russian gas. So clearly, what we want to see is not only for the next 2 years, but in the medium to long run, a situation where in Europe, we are less reliant on external sources of energy. This is simple to say, not always easy to do. Why? Because in most of our energies, including nuclear, including renewable at this stage, we have supply chains, and these supply chains are not purely European. However, and that's my first point, moving in a direction away from fossil fuel and accelerating the energy transition is a very good way to increase the independence and of Europe in terms of energy. What we need to be aware of is that we will need to decarbonize in a sustainable way, resilient, meaning we will need to ensure security of supply throughout the transition. And last but not least, we need to do it in the most affordable way. So that's the key challenge we're all facing, Europeans and North American alike. Have a sustainable, resilient, affordable energy transition that leads to decarbonation. And yes, it will increase our independence from other sources, because of course, renewable energy, be it wind, be it sun, are largely available everywhere. And when you think about energies such as biomethane, biomethane is the most, I would say, circular energy that you can think of. It's being made out of agricultural waste in large contents that enable the production of gas out of this waste. So that's very local. And indeed, when you look at a number of European countries, you will see biomethane units, sometimes very, very small, in agricultural farms that employ a few people in a very, very circular model. So that's a lot of autonomy. And speaking about biomethane, the estimate of the producers of such renewable gases is that it has the ability to replace Russian gas in a country like France by 2030. We are currently at roughly 2% of biomethane in the gas production of a country like France. It could go up to 20, meaning replacing Russian gas by 2030. So this is, I would say, autonomy in action. But what is true for biogas, biomethane, is true to some extent with renewable energy, provided we are mindful of the supply chain. And that's a big issue that we need collectively to face. The current supply chains are very dependent on a little number of countries. We need to be able in Europe, in North America as well, to encourage production that's less dependent on these foreign countries, to make these supply chains more robust, whatever the geopolitical shocks that we could be able to face in the years to come. So yes, renewable energy will make Europe more independent, more sovereign. Let's be careful about the fact that the transition has to be resilient and affordable, and let's work on our supply chain. And last but not least, how do we get to this model of more autonomy at an affordable price and in a resilient manner, so ensuring security of supply? We get to this point through a diversified energy mix. That's also a key lesson of the crisis. When you have energy mixes that are overly dependent on, be it on one technology, be it on one source of energy, you may run into difficulties. So let's be diversified enough, rely on electricity, on gases, more and more renewables, on heat, to make sure that this energy transition is not only bringing us more autonomy and independence, but also is going to be resilient.
Thank you. So since we are at the Forum des Amériques, Forum of Americas, one of the things that we can take inspiration from in the Americas, and what are also the collaboration, because given the threat that we have all felt, given the war and so on, we are talking about sovereignty, right? What are the maybe collaborations, things that we can do across the Atlantic with some elements of shared agenda?
Well, the first thing is probably to be stronger than we have been before being before entering into balanced cooperation. We need to be stronger. And at least in terms of financial markets, this is a key part of the agenda. Europe is divided between the ones who are very happy to be a continent of finance takers and the ones who are determined to be a continent of finance makers. And that's super important. For many players in the US, Europe is a part of a time zone called Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And many of their operations in this part of the continent, of the world, is about cherry picking the juicy assets and milk them to have a good return. And we are just a part of Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Now, for us, on this side of the room, at least Europe is just home. And because it's home, we need to be a continent of finance makers, among other things, which means uniting the markets to defragment the European markets, because clearly the asymmetry between the US and Europe is not about talents, is not about the size of savings, is about fragmentation. That's why building united capital markets is so important. That's why taking the single market to the next level is so important. That's why, as far as my company is concerned, we have built a market which is now which operates 25% of the equity markets in Europe, which has average daily volumes of about 12 to 13 billion euro, which, to give you a relative perspective, is about twice the size of the volumes traded in London and 3 times the size of the volumes traded in Frankfurt. So we are trying to build the backbone of the capital market union. We are trying to have aggregate market capitalization of companies listed on all markets around 6 trillion euro, 6,000 billion, so which is about twice the size of London. So if we can have within the European Union something as integrated as in the US in terms of capital markets, with a way towards a single supervision, with all sorts of united tools, then I think we are in good shape to cooperate. But it has to be on the clear basis that we can't just be a continent of wealthy clients. We have to be partners. And there are a few examples of those that I want to highlight here. All this buzz and somehow bullshit about the cloud. The cloud does not exist. What exists, the cloud is a meteorological concept. The cloud doesn't send invoices. What exists is large data centers of Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. But there is no such a thing as the cloud. So the question is whether Europeans can afford to have critical parts of their data, of their systems, of their applications hosted, operated in areas and in companies, in platforms that are under the management of the control of individuals who ultimately might have a different agenda at some point of time. And that's fundamental. I mean, all of us, we are happy to have the pictures or the photos of our vacation in a server in Cupertino. We are happy to have all our mobile phone numbers who cannot fit within the SIM cards to be in the same server in Cupertino. But do we want to have critical functions and critical data of our critical systems in Europe to be in such systems? So yes, there are areas of cooperation, as long as Europe is not looked at and treated as just a client of wealthy customers, but as a continent of partners.
Stéphane and Claire, I don't know. So it was going to be our concluding remarks.
Yes, so I must leave time for Claire. So the US are from time to time a competitor, and when we promote a rocket, we have with SpaceX a strong competitor. But they are also a partner when it comes to scientific partnership. Europe is part of the Artemis program, which is under the leadership of NASA and which is about returning to the moon. And here we need this kind of scientific partnership. We hope that one day Thomas Pesquet will go to the moon in the frame of this program. And you know that 1 year ago, it was a European rocket, Ariane, which has launched the most expensive and the most sophisticated telescope ever built in the world, which is the James Webb Telescope. So I really believe in the scientific cooperation with the US. The US can also be a customer, and for us, they are a very strong customer. Stéphane Boujna was quoting Amazon. Amazon has become this year the first commercial customer of Arianespace. They have their own project of constellation, which is called Kuiper, and they happen to have bought 18 rockets to us. So the US is also, for us, a very strong customer. And in Europe, we have a tendency to say the GAFAM, but the GAFAM, maybe they exist, but I can tell you that there is not one GAFAM. Apple, Amazon, SpaceX, all that, it's not the same company. They have their own interest. And I think it's very good to have some alliance with some of them. And what we have done with Amazon is very important for our future, but also for the transatlantic partnership. And what is true is that we need to have our own sovereignty. It's absolutely key for space. We want to have autonomous access to space, so we need to be sovereign. And in the domain of constellation, Europe has decided to have its own constellation. It is under the leadership of Commissioner Breton in the European Commission. And it's a good example. I mean, we have Amazon as a very strong customer for Amazon constellation. And on the other hand, Europe is going to have its own constellation, connectivity and secured constellation. It will happen in as early as 2024, for some existing assets in orbit, and after for specific satellite. But I think our relationship with the United States are not univoque. I mean, from time to time, it's a very strong competition. From time to time, we do not have the same interest, but also we have a vested interest to partner in scientific cooperation, to have US as a strong customer, and to do things together. And I come back to the last point I have said before. We are democracies. We belong to a world which is believing strongly in the freedom, in the fact that a citizen cannot be killed by a government, which is happening in many countries. And I think this is a strong rationale to do great things together. I really believe in that in the world to come.
Thank you, Stéphane. Alors, Claire, last but not least, complicated topic.
Yeah, but I would very much concur with what has just been said. I think first thing that we need to have in mind is that energy transition is not a zero-sum game. That may seem obvious, but at the end of the day, we are on the same planet. And whether we're able to tackle this issue effectively or not will affect all of us, regardless of whether we are in Europe, or whether we are in North America or elsewhere on the planet for the matter. So that's a first obvious thing to have in mind, meaning that all the progress, the collective progress that we're able to make on this path, including on research and innovation, are at the end of the day joint interests across continents, but more broadly of humanity. Sorry to be a bit eloquent at this stage. So there is room, of course, in research and innovation for joint work, and more broadly, I mean, this is an area where ideas and innovations from one side of the Atlantic Ocean will feed into the other, and vice versa. And that's why we need an open framework that enables as many, I would say, as many cooperation and as much trade as possible across these two zones. And when it comes to energy transition, we know that roughly almost half of the innovations that we need are still in front of us. I mean, clearly, I was talking about the importance of ensuring a resilient and affordable energy transition. This will require costs, including costs of renewable energies, to continue to decrease. So we need research and innovation, and for this we need openness across both continents. That's one. Second thing I want to say on these transatlantic links is that a bit like the space situation Stéphane was describing, we do have large North American and large American consumers, clients, as an energy company. They are a big driver nowadays of the race towards acceleration of renewable electricity production. Why? Because they are consuming a lot of energy, and they are very interested, in building long-term relationships that we call in the energy sector PPAs, power purchase agreements, that are built over an extended period of time and that provide green energy at a given price. This is what they need. In particular, we have contracts like this with Google, with Amazon. They do need that kind of visibility on their side. And we, as a utility, as a builder of renewable energy, we do need that kind of stability and visibility as well. So that's a good way to ensure joint interests. So they are important clients, and they are important in helping accelerate the development of renewable energy. Last, moving to the public sector, I think Europe has to learn sometimes a bit about looking at the way the US are moving. I'm very struck when I look at a few fields like hydrogen. I'm very struck by the fact that we in Europe had started earlier, but we sometimes take months, if not years, discussing about the colors of hydrogen. Where we take years discussing about whether we want only green hydrogen, whether we want low carbon hydrogen, is nuke hydrogen okay, is blue hydrogen okay. These are interesting debates, but the way the US are handling that kind of debates is saying we're putting subsidies on the table, and these subsidies depend on one thing. That's the content in carbon of hydrogen. That's a very pragmatic approach, much less sophisticated, but at the end of the day, it will enable the hydrogen industry in the US to probably move much faster. So that's what I mean when I say that we need to learn. Let's look at others. Let's avoid what we sometimes love in Europe, which are endless debates. And of course, since we have our national preferences, this endless debate can last for quite a while, but they're not compatible with the speed at which we need to move. So let's learn from the Americans, their pragmatic attitude, their speed, and let's make sure that in Europe, we're able to move swiftly as well.
Thank you so much. I think we are almost right on time. So thank you for sharing your views. I hope it was interesting, insightful for the people in the room. And that's it. We are done with this panel. Thank you, everyone.